Travel, I think, has been one of the best parts of the job. It means, though, that in addition to close to 100 countries, I've literally sailed the seven seas, been throughout the Pacific, across the Atlantic more than once, into the Baltic, the Mediterranean, you name it. I mean, the Arctic Ocean and beyond, the South China Sea. I mean, all these places that you can go to and not just sail through, but also dive.
Welcome to the second episode of Fascinated by Shipwrecks. I am joined here again by Dr. James Delgado, who goes by Jim. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about what a maritime archaeologist does. Jim, I wonder if you could tell me a day in the life. Now, of course, there's all kinds of scenarios that you could pull from, whether from your own life experience or what you've seen, your colleagues doing. You've worked and trained to do this kind of a job.
Well, let's start by saying that most any day involves a lot of reading. And I don't just say that because I'm married to a librarian. You're constantly reading. There's always new research, new scholarship, new opportunities to learn as well. I mean, I've got a bookshelf full of 19th century books, the area that I'm particularly fascinated by. So I always like to go back and read what people say about themselves or share their stories. So I'm always reading. And if I'm going from one project to another, I'm reading everything from technical details on a boiler being put together to the type of lamps that they're using, because you get down into the details of what you find, as well as the big sweeps of history, because I love what I do. And so let me start by saying, obviously, for many of us, this isn't just a job. It's a passion, and we love what we do. There's not that many of us around the world, but we try to make up for that by working collaboratively with each other. And many of the folks around the world are valued friends as well as colleagues. So my day as a maritime archaeologist can include everything from doing that reading and research and working on a past project's report, or writing a scholarly article about it, or working it into a book. But it's also preparing for the next project. These days, for me, the work that I do involves working professionally as part of a company that responds to projects where something is found, or we go and try to find something in advance of construction, whether it's laying a deep sea cable or working in harbor reclamation or dredging, you name it. There's a variety of those things. Plus, we also go and do missions of exploration and discovery. So you're always planning and doing that. The day changes when you deploy. And with that, yes, travel, lots of travel. I've now been close to 100 countries where I've interacted with or worked. A couple of those have been on holiday, but for the majority, they've either been work on projects, or they've been going to professional meetings or conferences, or doing detailed research in someone else's archives. Travel, I think, has been one of the best parts of the job. It means, though, in addition to close to 100 countries, I've literally sailed the seven seas, been throughout the Pacific, across the Atlantic more than once, into the Baltic, the Mediterranean, you name it. I mean, the Arctic Ocean and beyond, the South China Sea. I mean, all these places that you can go to and not just sail through, but also dive.
So what's it like when you head out onto a research vessel and you have to work with other colleagues, and you're kind of like in your own community and everybody has their job all together for 3 weeks? You probably know everybody that you're working with. Getting used to that as a sort of a new archaeologist in the field, what would that be like?
I'm always meeting new people every time I go on an expedition and when I'm out at sea. A couple rules of thumb for working at sea. One, pack light, but pack smart. Two, learn to live in smaller spaces. And yes, you're almost always going to have a roommate. I mean, ships are small. So people skills are one of those things they don't really talk to you about when you go to university and study, but it's essential. And ultimately what I found is, through the years, those who don't do well with that tend to sort of self-select out of the field. The good part for me has always been not just going to sea and being part of a small community and getting to know folks. It's been learning from each other, because on most of these ships of exploration these days, Archaeologists, I might be the only one. There might be a couple of us, and that's it, unless it's an archaeological mission. But even then, you're interacting with everybody on the crew whose jobs are to keep that vessel going and to keep it safe and to navigate it and to work with you as you launch robotic vehicles or you're diving. You're working with the crew that represent the rest of the science team, from the chemical and the physical oceanographers to the marine biologists to, if you're working with the equipment, the team that not only handle, repair, build, but also fly the remotely operated vehicles or launch and recover the autonomous underwater vehicles. And then you've got the most important person of all, the chef. So with that, it's another world. I like going to sea. In many ways, my office at my home is now configured much like a cabin without the bunk. But you get used to those smaller spaces. I've filled mine for the most part with books and files. But I mean, I like being at sea. There's something to be said for getting up early on a watch, and as fog is coming in, or you're just out on the open sea watching as the sun comes up over the ocean horizon or coming into port. Most recently, crossing the South Atlantic and pulling in to Cape Town, South Africa for the first time and seeing Table Mountain and to just see the lights come on and other ships moving in and out. And then suddenly the city is revealed as the golden rays of the sun strike the hills. It's magic, particularly if you've been at sea for a few weeks, as we were.
Yeah, I can just imagine that's part of that passion, right?
Yes, I would not recommend, if you're a maritime nautical archaeologist, that you get seasick or you don't like the sea or being on a boat. Just saying.
Can you say a little bit more about the advances in diving?
Dive technology really hasn't changed much other than what we breathe out of a tank. We used to just breathe plain air, but that can get harmful the deeper you go. You can suffer nitrogen narcosis, the so-called rapture of the deep, which can kill you because you get silly. They used to call it the martini rule. Every atmosphere, you went down, as the pressure built, it was the equivalent of drinking one stiff martini. And I recall at 180 feet, there we are. So, just a little under, 60 meters down underneath an overturned battleship at Bikini. And as the drunkest I'd ever been without having had a sip of alcohol because we were on air. You're trained to fight that. At least I was, because I'd gone to Army dive school. You change what you breathe. The gear remains basically the same. Though in some cases, we've gone from masks and mouth held to helmets. I've dived with those, going back to the origins of diving, because those first divers used helmets. But increasingly, a number of us, particularly for some of these wrecks that are in a deeper diving range, we now use robotics. But back to what we do as archaeologists, whether we were excavating or just documenting, we started by stretching tapes underwater and measuring things by hand and then sketching on frosted mylar. These days, I still take mylar with me to document here and there to make my notes. But if you're in a helmet, you can narrate your notes. But what you can also do these days is we use systems now that completely photo document and in 3D. So with that, you can capture and get things there, but it still doesn't hurt, for me at least, as that's all being done, to say, that looks like a crojack, a fitting for rigging a ship. And I don't want to forget that. So I write it down, unit 3, crojack, and that's spelled cross-jack, by the way. And that way I don't forget. So I still mix a little bit of my old school with what's happening now. And I think that's just okay.
And it's interesting how we have the ability now to have divers communicating through microphones and communicating between each other and to the surface and all of that. That has brought a lot more capability to doing that work.
It depends. I've dived with tethered systems where I'm talking to the surface. The most interesting one was when we used some of the earlier technology that actually broadcast through the water and you could hear each other, and you had these water phones and stuck into my ear, but also you could talk into them if you had a full face mask. I didn't, but I could hear. We were diving and a well-known pioneer of underwater cinematography was directing us. I appreciated some of it, but was reminded of one of the most wonderful aspects of diving, which is the peace and quiet that comes when you're under the water. When all of a sudden crackling into our ears as I was coming out of a wreck and going with the other diver to an area, suddenly we start hearing in our earpieces, idiots, 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 over here, over here. It's like, oh, but for the peace of the deeper ocean.
Can you explain a little bit about the different types of divers?
Well, you've got recreational divers, and these are people that are certified to go no deeper than, say, 30 meters, 100 feet. As the name implies, it's to see fish. It's to maybe dive and look at a wreck, but it's an opportunity to just be submerged in the undersea world and appreciate it. There are technical divers who take that to the next step by going deeper, using mixed gases that enable them to go deeper with less risk, larger rigs so that they can stay down longer and decompress longer safely. People that use rebreathers that recycle the air, adding oxygen as needed, again, for the same reasons, but with very specific and very focused training. You have commercial divers who dive to work. And with that, a number of them are hard hat divers. They wear a helmet, and some of them are surface supplied. Others may not need or use that. These are the folks that clean hulls, recover things that have gone over the side, that will work on oil rigs offshore, things of that sort. Important and powerful jobs, and those levels of training are intense. In some cases, these folks will stay down for a very long time, and so they'll live in a habitat on the bottom at the same pressure that they are diving at. So they can work for hours and stay down there, come in and out. Some cases they're using suits that have hot water being pumped into them so they don't freeze and cramp up. And then that capsule can be lifted, put on the deck. The dive continues at that same pressure that they've been at until they gradually decompress. That's because one of the things that was learned years ago was, it doesn't matter how long you've stayed, once you reach a certain atmosphere and you cross the line, the level of decompression that's needed remains the same. You can stay down for a week and do the same decompression procedure if you cross the threshold. Then there's military divers, and with those folks, and I've worked with some of them, you've got everything from the mobile diving salvage unit types, the MUDSUs, who are the military equivalent of the commercial divers. You have the EOD divers. Those are the ones who get rid of explosives underwater or blow things up underwater. And then you have spec war, the SEALs, for example, in the US Navy, and those are the undersea warriors. So a wide range of diving. I think the most important thing to remember is we use the term astronaut for those who walk in space and go into capsules. Aquanauts were those, and the term's not used as much anymore, but aquanauts are those who did the same thing underwater. Ultimately, inner space, outer space. The technologies are amazingly similar. One deals with loss of pressure, one deals with lots of pressure.
Can you say a little bit about how citizen science works? There's so many people involved now than there were back in the day. So what does that look like?
There are so many folks around the world who volunteer and participate. What makes their contributions invaluable is not just bringing in other folks to do the work. It's that some of them bring other exceptional skills. That goes all the way back to the beginnings, by the way. Some of the folks who worked with George Bass at Galedonia and then subsequently with the Institute of Nautical Archaeology were not archaeologists. Don Frey was a brilliant photographer, and his images of Bass's work not only documented the archaeology, but would make the cover of National Geographic, helping spread the story of what archaeologists were doing underwater to a global audience. There were others who brought other skills to the dive and to the project. And in a number of cases, as we do work now, we have folks who join us on dives who may not be archaeologists, but they know the marine life. They know the local history. They know a range of things that makes the project fuller, more rounded. Because every time you go down there, again, coming back to that exploration analogy, You need to bring something back, and that may not be an artifact. It most likely and should always be knowledge that can be shared, not just with other scholars, but with the public. So citizen science, as it's called, has evolved now so that teams will work. And those teams have done incredible things internationally. There's one group that I still belong to, and that's the Underwater Archaeological Society of British Columbia. And the UASBC folks have been around for decades. Very few of us are archaeologists. But people like Jacques Marc, past president, author of a number of the reports and studies, they do a better job than some of the colleagues I know that actually went to school to study archaeology. With people like Jacques Marc, you have a passion and a commitment. And I want to make one other point here. They're not getting paid to do this. They're paying to do this.
Yeah.
That kind of commitment just cannot be underestimated. It can only be applauded. Most British Columbians would be shocked to realize that practically all maritime archaeology in the province is done by volunteers working with the UASBC.
Yes. And I know Marc or Jacques, we go back quite a number of years.
Jacques Marc is one of my heroes, by the way. I think the
Yes.
world of Jacques, as well as so many others in the UASBC. But they're not alone. The folks in Australia, the folks in Germany, the folks all over, and the number of the dive groups that I've been able to work with in the United States.
When a shipwreck is found, like we could possibly take the example of the USS Stewart, since that is recent. What are sort of the next steps that happen besides getting prepared for the media onslaught? Like, what are you doing, in your job to work with your colleagues? And obviously you're documenting as you go, but what does that sort of piece of work look like?
Well, taking Stewart as an example, the project began with archival research. Not just knowing more about the history of the ship and getting the plans of the vessel, which is easier because it was a military vessel built under contract and they built a couple hundred of them. But it was also trying to figure out where it might be. Just because they said they sank it X miles out off of a coast leaves a large area to survey. So in the case of Stewart, my colleague Russ Matthews went out and did a lot of research, and in the U.S. National Archives discovered the logbook of the vessel, the tug Algorma, which had towed Stewart out to sea. And their logbook notes, at such and such a time, this vessel watched with its crew, they watched as Stewart sank at these coordinates. There was also a telegram sent to Washington, D.C. saying, on this, we sank Stewart at these coordinates. Those two coordinates were pretty close. But did they mean that was exactly where Stewart was? No, but those coordinates were then relayed to the survey ship. And so when the vehicles were sent down to hunt for it, 3,500 feet down, they took those coordinates and then drew a big box on a chart. And it was roughly 100 square miles. And then the vehicles that were sent to survey were programmed to work within that box and systematically search back and forth. When the vehicles came back up, and were downloaded, sonar image of a long, sleek shipwreck sitting on the bottom, upright, was there. Was that Stewart? Well, that then takes you to the next step, and that was to prepare for a dive, not by divers in this case, but by a remotely operated vehicle, an ROV. We all called in from different places, much as you and I are talking today. We all, from our various offices or institutes, linked together with the ship on station, worked with their crew and the ROV team as they flew that robot. So we ran the dive as the archaeologists, working with the team. They, of course, had complete control over the vehicle. They weren't going to get too close, and they were going to countermand an order if we said, get closer. No, that's going to snag us. But with that, the first thing you do with any archaeology, with pretty much any science, doctors know this too. A surgeon doesn't cut until they've done a lot of lab work, but also you get that MRI, you X-ray. So we systematically documented Stewart. And with that, not just zooming in and taking pictures or making observations with the recorded chat line, but also all of us, I'm sure, had our notebooks. I always have a notebook in front of me, old school as I am, but constantly, what about this? What about that? Yes, asking myself questions. We, of course, had the plans out before us. And so we could look at that and say, water clarity was pretty good. So you could see, at least as far as the lights went in that darkness. So we worked for 2.5 hours, which is all it took for a 311-foot long, shipwreck. And then the dive was over. On certain missions, what we'll do, if it's going to be a longer one and we want to capture everything to 3-dimensional accuracy, we'll do closer in sonar. In some cases, we're using lasers and doing LiDAR documentation underwater, but we're also taking systematic, continuous imagery that stitched together makes a photogrammetric model, 3-dimensional model, that's almost as good as diving it. In fact, with a number of the projects we've done, those 3D models, a number of which are now online with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM or BOEM's website for its underwater archaeology museum in the Gulf of Mexico, we go back through that data when it's really high res, and we have it on our systems. And it's almost like diving it again. Anything and everything that is visible is there. And we also have a sense of scale because the robots have lasers that hit the seabed, and we know exactly, oh, that's a 3-centimeter laser. So do nothing, do no harm to the patient until you've documented everything. You then write it up, you do your report. You explain what you saw, what the methods were, what you learned from the dive. In the case of Stewart, rocket hit here, a shell hit here. They took this off and that off. LB hatch was open to make sure it sank. The vessel has changed this much over time. Other scientists are looking and saying, well, there's a sponge, there's an anemone, look at this type of fish. So all of those observations get put into a scientific report, or if you're doing your job right, in my opinion, it's an academic article, or it goes into a book that talks about these various ships and their history and archaeology, but it also is out there to the public. If you're going to excavate, then it's a whole other range of not just questions, but approaches and what you will do. Excavation is a very different, costly thing. And as I've said to a number of colleagues, I don't mind doing excavations, and I've done a number through my career. But basically, with a very complicated shipwreck, by the time you get involved with that wreck and you move through excavating and excavate it all and have to study it and write it up, it's the equivalent of adopting a child. Decades of involvement and funding and support and seeing it through to the best ending, which is that it's all out there. Maybe you've added to history, maybe you've changed the perception of history, but you have met your obligations as a scholar and as a professional in making sure that you've documented that which you did and what you learned.
We watch documentaries on TV and it's all compressed time, but we don't see all of these endless hours of work. I really appreciate that look into a day in the life of a maritime archaeologist. So with that, I will end this episode. Thanks so much, Jim, for joining me. Fair wind and following seas.
Lost in time, the wreckage lies, broken masts and shattered pride. In the deep, the answers hide. Echoes of the past call out, whispers from beneath the waves. What secrets do the shadows keep? Do we dare disturb their sleep?